Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. Thank you as well to those joining us online. Happy New Year. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. This is our first lecture of the new year, but before I introduce our guest speaker, let me tell you what we have coming up and a few other logistics. To begin with, please silence your cell phones. Next Tuesday, we have Dr. John Delano, who retired from the University at Albany and has been a frequent presenter for GMALL. His talk is titled NASA's Search for Life Beyond the Earth. This is at 4 p.m. here in the library, but it's also on Zoom. John Delano will not be here in person, but he will zoom in on the big screen. The images he will share with you are spectacular from the James Webb Telescope, so much so we want you to get the full experience of seeing those images in their big and beautiful brilliance. And if you have ever attended one of his talks, you will know his enthusiasm is infectious. That is next Tuesday, the 23rd. Then on Thursday, the 25th, we have the start of a poetry roundtable discussion group moderated by Professor William Friedman of the University of Haifa. The group will study women poets in 6 consecutive sessions every Thursday from 2 to 3:30, and that's on Zoom. During Q&A today, we will have a microphone available in the room, even for the small audience. I insist you use it so that the folks online can hear you. And for those online, there is a chat feature for you to type your questions, and Liz will monitor those. I'd like to thank the Manchester Community Library for welcoming us here in this space, and to GNAT-TV for videotaping and running the live stream. Our guest is an Associate Professor of History and a Coordinator in the Studies in War and Peace program at Norwich University. She completed her BA in History at Reed College of Portland, Oregon, and her doctorate in History at the University of California, Irvine. Her research in military and institutional history focuses on Northeast China in the Republican period. At Norwich, she teaches wide-ranging introductory courses in world history and East Asian history, history courses on modern China and Japan, and specialized courses such as War and Image in Modern China. She is a member of the Association for Asian Studies, the World History Association, and the Chinese Military History Society. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Miri Kim.
Hello everybody, good evening. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really glad that folks who made it out braved the weather. And I'm also looking forward to questions from the audience here and also in our online audience after the talk. My talk today is called Shaping the 21st Century, China, the US, and Taiwan at the Crossroads. And I want to take you on a journey to kind of the late 19th century, 20th century story of Taiwan as sort of its central narrative, and bring in I think the important historical inflections that we can use to perhaps better understand Taiwan's place today, and also think about perhaps what's coming down the line. Although, one disclaimer, I am a historian by training, so please don't, ask me to make predictions about the future. I think historians are notoriously bad at predicting the future, but we love the past. And I think the more you know about the past, the better you have a sense of the present, I hope. Without further ado, let's take a little sort of foray into the 20th century, maybe a little bit into the 21st as well, and think about the 3 countries here, China, Taiwan, and the United States, and their intertwined fates. I think for being very disparate places in some ways, right, culturally, historically, demographically, these 3 places have a lot of influence on each other in a sense. So I'll start with Taiwan. I think it's a place that a lot of people are very interested in, but its history is not as well known as perhaps the history of the US or China. And if you are a casual observer of Taiwan, I think it's also very easy to perhaps forget some of the sort of traumatic and dynamics histories of Taiwan as well. Taiwan also, I think, has an unenviable position of being a very small place, a small country, right, between 2 very large and powerful countries with their own agendas that sometimes may or may not align with its own. And for its sort of tightrope walking between these two great powers, Taiwan has done remarkably well in certain respects. And I think today, if you look at places like Taipei, the capital city, if you have a chance to travel around the country on its wonderful railroad system, meet the people there, see the great culture, eat the great fruit, right? In places like Taidong, you'll see that it is a bustling metropolitan and very sophisticated place. It has wonderful bookstores. It has a wonderful nature preserves and so on and so forth. It's got lots of great resources, right? This actually has a role to play in its historical, I think, troubles, right, in the 20th century as well, for different groups kind of interested in exploiting these resources. But it's got wonderful mountains. It's got natural parks, Turco Gorge. There's a lot of mosquitoes as well. I know I can personally attest, very big mosquitoes. But it's a wonderful place, right? It's a beautiful place, and yet it is a place that's also beset with a very, I think, traumatic history. And perhaps an uncertain future as well. So where does Taiwan sort of fit into the matrix of U.S.-China relations, right? Our global relations, international communities, and the way that they consider rules around the status of countries, sovereignty, a lot of these kinds of questions. I think studying Taiwan actually provides us with a lot of really interesting insights into these questions. So let me start in the distant past, I suppose, of Taiwan, and it's a place that kind of enters the world imagination thanks to a lot of world trade developments starting in the 15th century, 16th century, and with the entrance of a lot of people interested in trade, including Europeans, into Southeast Asia, into East Asia, and they encounter in the island, right, called Formosa by some of these newcomers, folks who have been there for thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of Taiwan. And so I think Taiwan, right, has a very interesting place as a place that's claimed by China as a piece of the country that goes back thousands and thousands of years. It's an unalienable part of China. But I think if you really dig deep into the history of Taiwan, you'll see that it has a history that's not just shaped by these large powers or empires. There are still robust communities of people of indigenous background, and they have been beset by a lot of these historical forces. When the Japanese went there to colonize, right, in 1895, after their victories in the First Sino-Japanese War, they encountered people who were not part of a larger world trade system. They were kind of happy doing their own thing, and were suddenly sort of thrust into the middle of the sort of changing geopolitics. And so the story of Taiwan, I think, has to talk about the people of Taiwan and the peoples of Taiwan over the years. So when we want to complicate the story of Taiwan, I think in this way, we can bring in these different groups of people who have had a hand in shaping the history, shaping the terrain, literally blasting rocks into the mountains, cutting down the forests, building cities and infrastructure. And we can go far back, thousands of years, for the first people who arrived there on boats and so on and so forth. We can also go back to the Ming era, in the 15th century, where we have settlers from mostly the south eastern coast of China who are looking for land, looking for trade. They're not it's not the state pushing folks to go. It's a part of the economic development, right, of the story of the Ming period. We also know that in 1644, when the Ming dynasty falls, and the Manchus from the north start to come in and take over, some of the folks who served the old dynasty actually retreat to the island and sort of make their last stand there. It takes the Qing about 30, 40 years to really pacify the country. We have the Europeans who are making inroads, right, into the rich trading world of the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, sometimes by force, right? The Portuguese have a very thuggish reputation, I think. And they are not there for long, but I think they have a role to play, right, in sort of complicating the history of Taiwan as a place of desire, a place of a lot of intertwined ethnic histories, cultural histories. We also have more settlers from the Han majority. In the Qing period, we know that in the later half of the Qing dynasty, so after the 18th century, there's a lot of pressures in the empire as the population grows to 300 million people. Arable land in China is rather limited, and we see a lot of people sort of looking for places to farm, places to raise a family. So in the Qing period, people live at higher and higher elevation, right? Trying to find places to cultivate. They go to places like Taiwan to also find livelihoods. And more recently, in the late 19th century and sort of the earlier half of the 20th century, we have rival power, Imperial Japan, who sees China and also, of course, Korea as elements of a larger story for themselves, right? Places that can help fuel imperial ambitions to stand, strong on a world stage that has been dominated at that point by a lot of Western powers, also pushing into other parts of the world, Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and East Asia. So the KMT, the political party that until a few decades ago were kind of the only game in town, they're kind of, they join a very long list of people interested in Taiwan, in ruling Taiwan, and influencing Taiwan, and taking, stock, right, of its riches, its potentials and possibilities. So when we think about Taiwan, I think in this sort of rich history, China's claims to Taiwan is I think a part of its own imperial kind of history. The Qing dynasty, established in 1644, does something really unprecedented, which is really double the size of the country, right? From its Ming and earlier kind of core areas around the Yellow River Valley, Yangtze River Valley, and we add in the western territories of Tibet, Xinjiang, and then of course with settlers from the Qing period, a place like Taiwan as well. So Taiwan, I think, has a sort of interesting role, right, in the imperial story of the Qing, China, but it has its own story to tell as well. So the reason I'm going back into the Chinese side of the story is that Taiwan, right, and China have a shared story, right, shared history up until 1945 and 1949. And the story of the Chinese people, right? Chinese rulers, Chinese farmers, Chinese officials can't be told without this sort of shared, I think, DNA and shared influences and interactions with the outside. Famous episodes like the Opium Wars, right? In the middle of the 19th century, where attempts by the Qing to really curb the trade in this illicit substance bring in a level of Western intervention that is really unprecedented and opens up the country to great inflows of ideas, of peoples, of goods, unfortunately including things like the drug. And Taiwan, right, is part of the Qing story, I think, there. And the Chinese story of the 19th century, 20th century involves a lot of this kind of, I think, erosion of sovereignty, right? And the reason why China today, I think, is very sensitive to this topic, because there's historical experience of sovereignty being really tested and challenged and taken away, right, by these, outside forces, as well as internal issues, economic weaknesses, and things like that. So in the late 19th century, early 20th century, even before we talk about, the KMT and the CCP and Civil War and all sorts of things like that, the world of China is a world in flux. It's a world of many possibilities. It's a world undergoing incredible amounts of institutional, I think, change. One thing I'd like to say about institutions, because I study it in my spare time, I like to tell my students that institutions are like fly paper. They're sticky, right? They have rules, they have regulations, and the reason you stick to it and you don't leave like a fly, right, is you can't imagine a world beyond that, right? Institutions are powerful because we stick to them. We want to stick to them. And if a fellow fly tries to leave, right, those confines, well, look at that fly and say, you're not going to be okay. What's going to happen to your wings, right? And in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, China's undergoing a period where a lot of those fly papers, right, a lot of those institutions are dissolving, right? They're being taken apart. And on the one hand, it's a time of incredible, I think, distress, right? Because the things you stuck to, right, the traditions, the ideas, the expectations are sort of melting away. It's really scary. It's a really scary time, I think, for the people there. But at the same time, there's the possibilities of new fly papers, right? New institutions, new rules. So the story of China in the late 19th century, the 20th century, I think is one where we can sort of slot Taiwan into that has a lot of this kind of uncertainty as well as development. On the screen, you're seeing a photo taken in the sort of later part of the 19th century of the port of Guangzhou, called Canton at the time by many. And this kind of development is actually happening a lot all over the coast of China, as the Opium War kind of broke open the shell and allowed by the treaties, allowed outsiders to come in and trade really with an unfettered interest. You have Chinese people of China flocking to a lot of these areas for jobs and opportunities. You have people from outside lured in by the promise of riches and development and trade. And it's a world that I think invites a lot of scrutiny for just the potential of it as well. So when we think about the late Qing and the early 20th century and sort of the backdrop for where Taiwan fits into all of this, it's a time of great, I think, stress for the system. In China, the rulers are not sitting on their hands. They're actually trying to do a lot of things to try to reform, to develop, materials, infrastructure. But it's a tough situation. It's a tough situation. And we have, in the late 19th century, neighbors like Japan who are also undergoing their own set of stressors, having to sort of deal with very pushy outsiders who are interested in trade at almost any cost. Okay, but unfortunately for China, right, and maybe fortunately for Japan, the scale of the problems are very different. Right? China is this huge land empire, a very big agrarian, unlimited tax base, and it sort of is a bigger target for a lot of Western traders and people who are interested. Right? If you could trade in one of these two places, Japan or China, which would you choose? Right? All the consumers are in China, is sort of the thinking. So Japan also has, I think, a little bit of a heads up. Right? When the Opium War happens, there's a lot of great interest, and Japan also has sort of internal issues an elite, right, the samurai who are sort of unhappy with their lot and really interested in maybe finding different ways to parlay their skills, not in just the old sort of system. So it's a period of great change for East Asia overall. So in the early 20th century, China is sort of developing in the coastal areas, not quite by choice. The Qing rulers are very wary of a lot of these incursions, but it's undeniable that there are great fortunes being made. There are great architecture going up. There's an incredible level of human energy in this part of the world, and it fulfills a kind of, I think, a fantasy, right, for many, that it's a place of a lot of possibilities. There are fewer rules, right? It's one of the few, Shanghai, I think, in the period of, let's say, like World War II, right? Very few places remaining where you don't really need any kind of paperwork to go. So if you're fleeing violence from like Lithuania, maybe Shanghai is your port of call rather than other places, whether it's North America or what have you. So it's a world that's really beset with a lot of, I think, conflicting demands on it. And this is where we kind of bring in, I think, the story of the CCP and the KMT, the Kuomintang, the political party led by Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Yat-sen, and the Chinese Communist Party led by people like Mao Zedong. And the two have very different kind of visions of what the country can be. The CCP, the Communist Party, really, I think, frame their struggle in this larger story of China beset by outsiders, beset by challenges to its sovereignty, by these sort of demands on its resources without repercussions, right, for these outsiders. And for the KMT of Chiang Kai-shek, this is a world that needs to be put in order, right? And it needs to have rules. It needs to foster business. It's not the time to break things apart, right? China's already quite messy, right? With a lot of institutions starting to fall apart, being replaced, and so the two sort of political parties really don't see eye to eye. And after Japan's surrender in 1945, all the gloves are off. Okay? Any kind of pretense that working together against a sort of common foe goes away, and we enter into a period of civil war. So if you're an average person in China, right, this first half of the century is really constant turmoil and disruption. And in some ways, these political parties, I think, represent a promise of stability. Now, there's a reason, I think, and in 1945 and then again in 1949, many communities really weary from many decades of exploitation, many decades of warfare, of displacement. Look at political leaders who have offered up some ideas as perhaps an end to maybe a shift into more stable conditions. Chiang Kai-shek and his party militarily are no match for Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong has a lot of support. I won't go into the story of the Civil War. It's a quite, I think, complicated one. But for our intents and purposes, again, to sort of think about Taiwan, the KMT are the losers. They retreat to Taiwan, and although they claim to be the only legitimate China, they only have control of the island. And the CCP, since 1949, has retained control of the mainland. So for a long time after, there was a big question about who's the real China. Right? Who's really qualified to represent the Chinese people, the Chinese way of things? And for a while it was Taiwan, okay, but unfortunately a lot of winds geopolitically shift for the country, and I think it really decisively shifts in the early 70s with Richard Nixon's kind of, I think, rapprochement, okay, his overtures to China his historic 8-day visit, a meeting with Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and others, and China sort of practicing also what's called ping pong diplomacy, sort of putting itself out there. In the 70s, Richard Nixon makes this really, I think, big gamble to kind of wade into the Soviet-China tensions and make more of a commitment for the U.S. to be in Asia, I think. And China, rather than Taiwan, is sort of the partner, right? Maybe the future partner of choice. Taiwan's, fall from international status of being China, right, being the legitimate China, to perhaps kind of an orphan country, also coincides in the middle of this century with many, I think, decolonization movements around the world. So many countries that have had their own histories of colonial violence and struggle coming into their own and really sort of framing the story of China and Taiwan in those terms. Right? Taiwan, led by Chiang Kai-shek, very pro-capitalism, U.S. ally, quite authoritarian in his own way. Not to say that the CCP wasn't also interested in methods of control, but for a lot of countries, Taiwan seems to represent kind of an illegitimate answer, right, to the question, what is Taiwan? So if you look at the timeline of sort of major events that have affected Taiwan on sort of the international stage, in terms of its status, I think you kind of see this general shift, right, where from being considered China, right, worthy of a seat at the table representing this great nation, in 1971 there is a pretty big majority of countries, many of them very new, right, deciding that no, I think the PRC is the country on record, and China, I think, takes to this role as well. Right? They are rivals with the Soviet Union, but it's also got leaders, especially after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, leaders who really see a lot of potential in the country, right, and see a chance for it to steer itself away from some of its own internal imbalances and controversies towards something more, especially economically stable for its people. So Taiwan sort of keeps a low profile for a while, and it's the SARS epidemic. So kind of a precursor to COVID, I guess, in terms of a lot of the changes that it genders, where Taiwan actually kind of comes back into play and sort of asserts itself a little bit more. And since then, we've seen, I think, this kind of tension between China, which really denies Taiwan's ability, right, to really participate, because the argument is that Taiwan is not a country, right? It's not its own sovereign nation, so they can't join the World Health Organization. They can't, represent themselves and have a seat at the table. And Taiwan, which argues that, well, a lot of the things that you're talking about are directly affecting the health and security of our people, right? SARS, especially, I think that Taiwan had like the third highest mortality rate. I think since then, Taiwan's performance kind of keeping, mortality rates low, overall satisfaction with the government's handling of COVID, it's sort of, I think, asserted itself more in that respect, right? Here's a country that seems to know what it's doing and perhaps should be accorded some voice, right? But so far, those attempts have been, I think, sort of spinning the wheels, right, in the sort of the status quo. And very recently, just a few days ago, actually, the very small island nation of Nauru formally cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan and resumed ties with China. Okay. So why does this matter in Nauru or in other countries? Well, I think it shows the relative isolation of Taiwan, right? A very big shift in the story from being China, right, to the world, to Taiwan, and having only a handful of supporters at the UN. And most of these countries are also very small in population. They don't have a lot of influence in world politics, or even have a vote, right? So it's a holy see in the Vatican. They're not a voting member of the UN. So island countries like the Marshall Islands, countries like Belize, Taiwan's friends officially it's a very small list. But at the same time, Taiwan real allies, right? Or I shouldn't say the real allies. The allies that really have a lot of clout are perhaps the unofficial ones, right? The United States, I think, comes to mind. So Taiwan's status in the world is also sort of odd, right? Because formally, they are really isolated, right? Very marginalized in the international community. They're not welcome, right? If you sort of, I think, interpret it that way. But unofficially, Taiwan has very, very strong ties with the U.S., although the U.S. has always, I think, sort of put off the story, put off the question of Taiwanese independence. And in fact, the official position of the United States government does not support Taiwanese independence. In actuality, Taiwan and U.S. have a very strong, I think, sort of military interests at heart together. I think the U.S. has, consistently given out the signal that Taiwan's future, right, should not be one of war, right, one where China invades or the Taiwanese people loses their sovereignty. So now shifting the focus, I think, really directly on Taiwan. If you recall from the earlier part of the talk today, the picture of the 101 building in Taipei, beautiful nature, the great people there. I think it's easy also to forget that Taiwan itself has a very, I think, difficult history. And what you see with the recent elections, very successful ones for the presidency in Taiwan that just concluded, the democracy there is actually quite young. In fact, the rules for the presidential elections that were just held are really from like 2012. Right, so only about a decade or so, and Taiwan still has a lot of ghosts. I think the period between 1949 and 1992, euphemistically called, or not euphemistically, but called the White Terror, was a period where enemies of the state, enemies of the government, or people who are determined to be these kinds of elements, were oftentimes detained without legal rights, tortured, murdered, disappeared, right, without any kind of recourse. And there's a lot of, I think, pain and even anger, right, over this kind of treatment under the rule of the KMT, especially during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I think Syria is the only other place with a longer record of martial law in the modern period, something like 50 years. But Taiwan was under martial law for about 38 years, and it's only really since the 90s, after lots of efforts from the grassroots, a lot of young energy students protesting, that we've seen the kind of results today, where we have more direct voices from the people, electing the representatives, being heard. And today, I think Taiwan, a lot of people see it as kind of a bright spot in a time where I think democracy is often under question, where we see it working really well, very transparent. I think the recent presidential elections in Taiwan, the turnout was something like 76%, quite high. And it's actually less than the last election, surprisingly. So Taiwan is in I think, a moment of transformation, and it's been transforming itself for a long time, right? For the past several decades. And the future, I think, will be more of this kind of transformation, right? There's this authoritarian past that is full of violence, that is full of a lot of pain, a lot of unanswered questions. But there's a lot of hope as well for, I think, the future, especially with the participation of citizens who live there, who are not all Han Chinese, by the way. There's a significant number of people who are of indigenous background, who have a very different relationship with China, right, and Chineseness, because they're a minority who don't share that cultural history, right? So the 90s, we see more and more sort of this democratization in Taiwan, the really passionate involvement of young people there, selecting things like the Formosan lily as a symbol of hope and virtue. And I think it comes at the heels of a lot of that energy in the 1970s, where you see a lot of student movements around the world. Tiananmen in 1989, I think, really infamous for a moment of that kind of blooming that was repressed by the state. But I think that energy is really undeniable, right? And in Taiwan, you see it, I think, have a moment there, and also picked up later by others about a generation later. So let me talk briefly about, well, not briefly, but talk a little bit about the presidential elections that were just held. There's been great commentary on this, by the way. I think if you just open up, YouTube, right, and look at reports from various news organizations or see the news, there's a lot of, I think, great analysis going in. So what I want to do is just give a quick background, and then have us sort of think about, where this all fits into the story of China, US, and Taiwan. As I mentioned, it's a pretty recent kind of system that looks the way it does. And the way that the voting works is political parties must get at least 5% of the votes. You can't really have fringe parties. You need at least 5% support. And the legislative yuan, so their version of Congress, have a way of sort of proportioning the seats where 73 of the members of that legislature basically sort of majority takes all. But 6 members, so pretty, I think, significant number, are actually elected by indigenous communities. So about 500,000 people in Taiwan, about 80% of them are registered voters, and it's a very important block. And then 34 members of the legislature get voted in by sort of proportion. So how much of the vote they overall receive, not just a majority take all kind of system. So it's a really interesting, I think, attempt to kind of balance majoritarian rule in terms of Taiwan's young democracy. And it's really important, I think, to see that there are voices that are not just part of this narrative about Taiwan belonging to China forever, or Taiwan being a completely different kind of place, where we have the indigenous communities who have had very fractious relationship with both the Qing or the KMT, right, or the Japanese colonial period, where they were under a lot of, I think, pressure, threat, loss of their culture. And this is, I think, a sort of a renaissance right now, where as Taiwan is democratizing, you see more of these voices that were suppressed earlier, under the KMT, under political repression, coming out and offering a kind of, I think, sort of a third kind of voice, right? Neither just purely, in part of the Chinese narrative or else. So the three, we know the story, right? Lai Ching-te, or William Lai, as he's also known, has taken the presidency. He's going to be the president-elect coming in a little bit later this year. But he's only won about 40% of the vote. So 60% of the electorate did not vote for this candidate. And during the election period, there was also actually some concerns from the DPP, the ruling party, that if the TPP and the KMT sort of joined forces, that they would have been able to win the race. And that didn't really happen. These two candidates really didn't see eye to eye. There was also a fourth sort of dark horse candidate, the founder of Foxconn, who had some support, but these are the three main folks. So Lai Ching-te enters the conversation, the geopolitical scene, without really, I think, a very clear mandate. Or an overwhelming mandate, right? It's clear that a lot of voters are not perhaps like, they're not putting all their chickens in the basket of the DPP, who are more, I think, pro-Taiwan, a little bit more wary about China. But I think the other parties, right, the KMT or the TPP, they're also not pro-unification, right? A lot of, I think, people in Taiwan really like the status quo. And so it's on this sort of spectrum of maintaining status quo, but with more emphasis on, reconciliatory gestures or more ease of, right, relations with Beijing, versus a little bit more assertive, being a little bit more confident in sort of Taiwanese identity. So when we look at, I think, the trajectory so far, we see a move away from authoritarianism, very, very hard one, and really affected by the energy of the people who have sort of fought for these kinds of changes, and a shift into kinds of leadership that, rather than being very, very sort of in tune with what Beijing wants, seeing a little bit more of what Taiwan and the people there want. And I think what's really interesting from the Chinese perspective, so the PRC perspective, is that, it's clear that the more sort of belligerent Beijing is, the more it pushes away Taiwan, right? And I think this is not lost on leaders in Beijing, but at the same time, Beijing needs to see probably more reassurance from the Taiwan side that there's no move towards independence, something that would really change the status quo for them to make that step and be a little bit more like hands-off, right? This is, I think, still a period of kind of détente. And neither side can really back down, but neither side is really ready to take it to the next level, which would be, I think, disastrous for not just these places, but probably for the world. So China, right, has its own kind of shifting story. After about a decade of really incredible economic growth and change, a shift from the so-called third generation leaders who shepherded a lot of that early economic development to the pretty boring and bland fourth generation leaders. They're not really known for it's theatrics or drama. They just kind of did their own technocratic thing. We've seen a period of slowdown recently, but it's still 4.6% GDP growth. And the Chinese people, or the people there, they're ingenious. They're hardworking, and they have a lot to, I think, say. If not for a lot of the conditions that they face, a lot of the stresses that they are under. So at the beginning of Xi Jinping's tenure as president, we had a lot of sort of interesting things happen in China, right? Downfall of rivals like Bo Xilai. The most popular search term in China in 2012 was this term that says basically like poser, right? Like, so people were kind of curious about this, like, who are posers? Am I a poser? Right? So there's a lot of this kind of, reflectiveness, and this attempt to, I think, sort of help China transition away from more polluting fuels like coal. Although environmental groups at the time and since then have really raised a lot of alarms about things like fracking and shale, but it seems to be continuing on. Recent licenses granted. Of course, we can't leave out other neighbors in the mix who have their own kind of agendas and also beef with Beijing. China also saw a lot of reforms legally, right, to try to create a state of rule of law. But I think the scorecard that has been quite mixed. Okay, so in 2023 and 24, what can we sort of expect from China, Taiwan, U.S. Relations? I think a lot of that will have to do with what happens domestically in China. And for Chinese leaders, their biggest kind of concern is actually more, I think, domestic issues, not international ones. There is an incredible demographic imbalance, and more young people, men and women, both really kind of saying no, right? Saying no to a lot of things that their parents took for granted, things like marriage and children. So much so that the government, with Xi Jinping, is really sort of pushing this idea that women should get married, they should have children. And a lot of young people are like, but I really don't want to. I think it's going to be expensive. Okay, I don't think I'm going to have the same opportunities. It's hard to find a job. And so one of the concerns, I think, because of this, is that China's looking at a demographic, a bombshell with a really rapidly aging population. So in the short term, does this mean more repression for people there because the government is very sort of, I think, forceful, right, in trying to get a lot of these programs across. You also see a growing middle class, and I think this trend is going to continue, right? So you can see numbers like, I think the pet industry in China, like $83 billion this year and growing, more interest in leisure sports. So there's a growing number of people who also have a lot of that kind of economic voice, if not necessarily a political voice, for what they want to see in the country to continue this kind of progress, right? Economic progress. So Taiwan coming in and becoming a political bomb, right? Taiwan coming in and sort of making that status quo a lot less certain is probably not going to be very popular with the Chinese public either. right? The specter of war has a way of depressing economic projections, I think. So as the economy is actually slowing from those sort of heyday years of the early part of the 21st century, and looking at Xi Jinping continuing to be in this role of leader and visionary for his country, I think it's sort of interesting to see that the line on Taiwan has hardened, right? In his first speech ever given in public as the new incoming president in 2012, Xi Jinping made this, I think, statement about the greatness of the Chinese people, his hopes for bringing China kind of back to form, and he's not wrong, right? For most of its history, China has been economically a powerhouse. It was admired by many as late as the 18th century. Okay. Voltaire, that famous China booster, unlike one of his contemporaries like Montesquieu, Voltaire was much more, happy about sort of China and its prospects. Right, he described it as the best governed country in the world. It's sort of, I think, using it to criticize his own sort of dissatisfaction with systems in Europe, right? The control of the church, aristocracy, and things like that. But if China becomes a great superpower, surpasses the ones that came before, it would not be a new story. It would be a return to form, to the greatness of some of these earlier empires and their economic kind of clout. So I think from that perspective, right, it seems natural to want Taiwan to share in that kind of glory, in that kind of return to form, and it would be odd, right, to sort of sit out. And I think from the Beijing perspective, and thinking about sort of what's happening in Taiwan in the past few years, this kind of, I think, effort to try to bring Taiwan in to this sort of vision of what China can be, is quite problematic, because even within China itself, right, I don't think you would find anyone who would disagree with the idea that China should be powerful, China should have economic stability, should be able to offer a good life to the people living there. But how to get there is something that even people in China have a lot of disagreements about, even if you don't really hear it perhaps in public. So China at this sort of crossroads of wanting this sort of great future, right, with all of its peoples, minority groups included, perhaps these wayward orphans like Taiwan included, it's I think at a crossroads of a lot of perhaps possibilities into the 21st century, but one that's really maybe limited by circumstances, especially pollution, environmental concerns, the demographic cliff looming. And it's not really helped by, I think, since the past few years, a shift in sort of worldwide opinion about China, as well as it asserts itself in the region, in the world. You'll still find a lot of folks happy with this, right? If you go to Serbia, very recently, they're welcoming Chinese investment for mining and revitalization of the industrial sector there. You see, of course, those great stories about the Belt and Road Initiative in many parts of the world. But views of China have shifted quite dramatically in the past few years. Just in the US alone, probably the most dramatic story of the unfavorable rating for a lot of people viewing China shifting from somewhere in the 40s to 80%. That's very, very high, right? Will this trend continue? I don't know. I don't want to predict the future, but if the tensions that exist now continue, I think we can see that this number might not come back down to those numbers of like 2006, 2007, right? But of course, the story is a bigger one than just these countries. It's one that involves, I think, other countries in the region, some wild cards like North Korea, or countries that you might not think of initially, but may have a role to play in the future. For example, China recently has really tried to push itself as an Arctic nation, a country with an interest in what happens in the Great North, putting it into conflict potentially with places like Canada, right, which also claims a lot of that, with the ice melting and maybe Northwest Passage and things like that. So on my final slide, what does the future hold? I think the relations between China and its neighboring countries will have a lot to play in how Taiwan sort of fits into the matrix, because China's neighborliness or lack thereof is something that can really, I think, sort of limit, right, or allow China to project more influence. And although the U.S., since the 70s has been kind of in Asia in sometimes physical forms like military bases, exercises, I think there's always this kind of question about U.S. commitment, right? Is the U.S. really committed to Asia? Is it really willing to go to bat, right, for places like Taiwan or on behalf of Indonesia, Philippines? I think the U.S. is actually a sort of a wild card as well for a lot of folks outside of the U.S. And I think that the past few years of sort of political kind of stories, right, in the U.S. has not helped that image. And if China shifts on its sort of way of formulating sovereignty, right, to make it a little bit more palatable for Taiwanese independence to coexist with Chinese, claims, I think that would be sort of interesting to keep an eye, watch on. And the other thing that we can sort of keep an eye on is how all of these countries involved tackle these larger questions. I think China is very committed to these sort of like environmental challenges and solving them. So we'll see if they take a leadership role in that, and how the U.S. and Taiwan kind of fit into that story as well. So I'll end here. Sorry for going over a little bit of time, but I hope that we have some time for questions, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really
I think there's a... Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. My question is more military. Do we have a treaty or a commitment to support Taiwan at this time, and do we still have a military presence there?
Okay. Yeah, so the United States and Taiwan are, I think, still pretty strong partners, militarily speaking. For example, like joint exercises, and the leadership of the two places, Taiwan and the U.S., have a lot of close communications, and I think avenues of communications open. So militarily, Taiwan and the United States are allies, and I think that although on paper the United States is not committed to Taiwanese sovereignty. In fact, often it sort of regularly makes statements to sort of the opposite, contrary. In practice, I think as long as China poses a kind of existential rivalry threat, right, from the perspective of folks in Washington and the military chain of command, Taiwan is an essential partner in the region in the same way that like South Korea is an essential partner in the region. And I think that no one in the United States or Taiwan, or maybe even in China, really wants to put this to the test, because to take the threat of war, right, to actual war, I think would require commitment and really big changes, right, in the governing sort of theories of all of these places involved, and the results would be quite, I think, devastating, sort of economically speaking, just on the economic side, right? Taiwan, a place that is a great fab for important materials like superconductors, semiconductors. China's not alone. It's the biggest country in the region, but other countries like the Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam. I think if China was to take it to that next level, these other countries would also be kind of, I think, activated and encouraged to move, right? And that kind of instability in a part of the world where a third of the population of the human race lives, and an incredible amount of economic activity happens to take place, I think doesn't make a lot of sense, right? That's not to say that I think Beijing has always kept that option on the table, and they talk about this. And in fact, in the past few years, kind of the harassment of Taiwanese, like Coast Guard, seafarers there, has really ramped up. So, and the same thing with cybersecurity attacks as well. But I think the military alliance, the military partnership with Taiwan and the United States is there, right? And it cannot be discounted. So I hope that answers your question.
I'm sorry I got here a little bit late, but maybe you answered this already. Do you know approximately what the percentage of China's trade is with the United States?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, so I apologize. But I think the United States is actually not China's biggest trade partner or the only important trade partner to consider. We have the European Union, right, with China. We have neighbors, very close neighbors like Japan and South Korea. Recently, when Japan released sort of nuclear radioactive water, seawater into the ocean, there was a really big concern in Japan about boycotting of Japanese goods by Chinese consumers. So when we talk about the Chinese economy, the U.S. is actually kind of not the only sort of partner or potential market or potential source. And there's actually a whole different, I think, sort of matrix of countries that have really strong or key kinds of relations. I think a few months back, there was this move from Chinese consumers to boycott Taiwanese pineapples because of some of the things that the Taiwanese were doing. And so even Taiwan, with its kind of sort of contentious relationship with China, really can't discount it as a major trade partner. So I think sort of going around that question a little bit, the United States can't assume itself to be, I think, the be-all, the end-all for China trade. China has a lot of other options and a lot of other, I think, relationships that it can explore. And in places oftentimes where the U.S. is not a big, I think, presence, right? Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa and so on and so forth.
Do you know a good website to get that information?
After the talk, I'd be happy to chat with you and maybe make some recommendations. Thank you. Yeah.
Because I'm just thinking about how in the 70s and 80s, all of the manufacturing in this country went to China.
Yeah.
And it's a major change.
Yeah, and what's kind of interesting in the past, I think, few years is that as the standard of living in China has risen, we actually see some of those same factories now moving out of China because the labor there is now too expensive for these multinational corporations. So Vietnam actually is now a sort of a lucrative place for some of these factories to go, where the standard of living there still, the median wage hasn't caught up yet. And so places like Vietnam or Indonesia, or I think also India, sort of positioning itself as kind of the next factory of the world. And so the challenge for China is that it's actually moving through the stages of economic development, kind of like the stages of grief. You've got like the period where you have to do, like this kind of industrialization for factory work, and then you want to shift your economy into a service sector economy. And it's happening maybe a little bit too fast for China because the economy is actually not really there yet in terms of being able to be really robust with just like service sector kind of industries. But the bottom is falling out in terms of the industry, the manufacturing leaving the country. So I think this will be actually, thank you for the question. I think this is a really important place to keep an eye on because China is now kind of middle class enough that it's not an attractive place for a lot of multinational corporations to find their cheap factory workers.
Okay, I guess we'll end a little bit early. I want to thank you very much, and I want to thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions and coming out here on sort of a tough winter day. And I look forward to talking with you after the formal end of the talk as well. Thank you.
Thank you.